before we begin, take a second and think about this question. Why would God choose one small, often rebellious nation instead of powerful empires? And what if the answer changes how you see yourself today? If you're watching this, write in the comments where you're watching from, and stay with me until the end, because this story is not just about Israel, it's about you. It didn't begin with a nation. It began with a man, not a king, not a warrior, not someone impressive by human standards. A man named Abraham. He lived in a world full of idols, surrounded by cultures that had already built systems, cities, and power structures. Nations that seemed strong, established, important, and yet God didn't choose them. Instead, he spoke to Abraham with words that must have sounded almost impossible. Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. No map, no guarantees, just a promise. And Abraham went. That was the beginning. From Abraham came a family. From that family came 12 sons. From those sons came a people, a nation that would later be called Israel. But here's the strange part. They didn't start strong. They became slaves. In the land of Egypt, the descendants of Abraham were oppressed for generations. They were beaten, controlled, and reduced to nothing more than labor. If God had chosen them, why would he allow that? Because the story was never about power. It was about purpose. Then came a moment that changed everything. A man named Moses stood before the most powerful ruler on earth and said, "Let my people go." Not because they were strong, but because they were chosen. And through miracles that shook an empire, God led them out. Not quietly, not secretly, but in a way the entire world would remember. And yet, even after seeing the sea split, after walking through it on dry ground, they doubted, they complained, they rebelled, they wanted to go back. Think about that. A nation that had seen undeniable power still struggled to trust. So why them? Why choose a people who would fail over and over again? Because God wasn't looking for perfection. He was building a story, a living example. Through Israel, whose name was changed to Israel, God established a people who would carry something no other nation had. A relationship, not based on strength, not based on size, but based on covenant. Other nations had gods, but their gods demanded rituals without relationship. Israel was different. They were given laws not just to control them, but to shape them. They were called to live differently, to forgive, to show justice, to care for the poor, not because they were better, but because they were meant to reflect something greater. And still, they failed. Again and again, they turned to idols. They ignored warnings from prophets like Isaiah. They followed the patterns of the nations around them, and every time, there were consequences. But here is where the story shifts. Because the choice of Israel was never meant to exclude others. It was meant to reach them. God told Abraham something most people overlook. Through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Not just Israel. All nations. Israel wasn't chosen instead of others. They were chosen for others, to carry a message, to prepare the way. And then, generations later, something happened that changed everything. From this small, imperfect nation came a man who would reshape history. Jesus Christ, born not in a palace, but in humility. He didn't come to elevate Israel above others. He came to open the door to everyone. That is where the story becomes larger than borders, larger than bloodlines, larger than ancestry, larger even than history, as most people understand it. Because from the beginning, God was never building a private circle. He was unfolding a rescue plan. Israel was the vessel. The law was the tutor. The prophets were the warning voices. The covenants were the foundation. The temple was the shadow. The sacrifices were the signposts. And then, when the time was right, the one all of it pointed toward finally came. And when he came, he did not speak like a man trying to protect a nation's privilege. He spoke like a king announcing a kingdom no wall could hold. He touched lepers. He spoke to women others ignored. He ate with tax collectors. He stopped for beggars. He praised the faith of foreigners. He crossed lines religious men would not cross. Again and again, he showed that God's holiness was not fear of sinners, but power to cleanse them. That shocked people, because many had come to believe chosenness meant superiority. But Jesus revealed that chosenness had always meant responsibility. Israel had been chosen to carry the promise, chosen to preserve the truth, chosen to protect the line through which the Messiah would come, chosen to demonstrate what life under God's rule should look like, chosen to be a light among nations trapped in darkness. But a light does not exist for itself. A lamp is not lit so it can admire its own flame. It is lit so those sitting in darkness can finally see. That is why the story cannot stop at Abraham. It cannot stop at Moses. It cannot stop at David. It cannot stop at the prophets. Because every one of those stories, as great as they are, is unfinished without Christ. Abraham teaches us faith, but faith in what? Faith in the God who keeps promises beyond a human lifetime. Moses teaches us deliverance. But deliverance into what? Into covenant life with a holy God. David teaches us kingship. But kingship under whom? Under the greater Son, whose throne will never end. The prophets teach us judgment. But judgment for what purpose? To cut down false hope, so true hope can remain. Everything moves forward. Everything points ahead. Everything says, again and again, someone is coming. And when that someone came, he did not abolish the story of Israel. He fulfilled it. That matters. Because some people hear this and assume that if Jesus opened the door to everyone, then Israel no longer mattered. But that is not what the Bible shows. Israel mattered because through them, the promises were carried intact through centuries of warfare, idolatry, exile, restoration, weakness, and waiting. The scriptures came through them. The covenants came through them. The prophets came through them. The temple system came through them. The categories through which we understand sin, holiness, sacrifice, mercy, covenant, kingship, priesthood, and redemption came through them. And above all, according to the flesh, the Messiah came through them. So the question is not whether Israel mattered. The question is whether we understand why they mattered. They matter because God was writing a story of redemption in human history, not outside of it. He did not drop salvation from the sky as a detached concept. He planted it in a family line. He protected it through generations. He revealed it through real people, real places, real failures, and real mercy. He allowed the world to watch what happens when a holy God binds himself by covenant to a stubborn people. And what the world saw was astonishing. They saw judgment, yes, but they also saw patience. They saw discipline, but they also saw mercy. They saw rebellion, but they also saw restoration. They saw that the God of Israel was unlike the gods of the nations because he was not a tribal invention made in man's image. He was a creator who entered history and spoke with moral authority over kings, priests, nations, and hearts. That is why Israel's history is so uncomfortable. If this were propaganda, it would have been written differently. It would have hidden the shame. It would have cleaned the record. It would have turned every ancestor into a flawless hero. But the Bible does not flatter its own people. It exposes them. Abraham lies. Jacob deceives. Aaron compromises. Moses disobeys. David falls. Solomon turns. The nation rebels. The priests corrupt themselves. The kings divide the people. The people chase idols. The prophets weep. Jerusalem trembles. The temple falls. Exile comes. And still, the promise survives. That is one of the strongest signs that the story is driven by God, not by man. Man writes stories to protect his image. God writes stories to reveal his glory. And his glory is seen most clearly when human weakness cannot stop divine faithfulness. That is what Israel teaches. Not that one ethnic group was morally superior. Not that one people earned grace. Not that God looked across the earth and found the most righteous nation and rewarded them. No, the message is almost the opposite. God chose what was small. He chose what was weak. He chose what could not boast. So that when the blessing came, no one could say, "We built this by our power." That is why Deuteronomy says God did not choose them because they were more numerous than other peoples, for they were the fewest. He chose them because he loved them and because he was keeping the oath he swore. In other words, the foundation was not their greatness. It was his faithfulness. That changes everything. Because if God's plan depended on human strength, there would be no hope for the rest of us. If chosenness were a reward for moral achievement, then no sinner could enter. If election were merely divine applause for human excellence, then grace would no longer be grace. But Israel's story crushes that illusion. Israel is chosen and then immediately tested, chosen and then humbled, chosen and then corrected, chosen and then carried, chosen and then confronted. The pattern is clear. To be chosen by God is not to be excused from accountability. It is to be drawn deeper into it. The closer people are brought to divine truth, the more their response matters. That is why Israel's failures were so serious. Not because they were worse sinners than everyone else, but because they sinned against greater light. And that is also why their story speaks so directly to anyone who claims to know God today. Because light still demands response. Truth still creates responsibility. Grace still calls for surrender. And privilege without obedience still becomes judgment. That is one reason this subject matters so much. People often ask, why didn't God just reveal himself equally to every nation in the exact same way? But that question assumes God's justice must look like equal distribution of identical experiences. The Bible shows something different. God is not unjust because he reveals himself progressively through history. He is wise. A teacher does not hand a child the final exam before teaching the alphabet. A builder does not place the roof before laying the foundation. A composer does not begin a symphony with the final note. God unfolds truth with purpose, timing, and order. He starts with one man, then one family, then one people, then one land, then one covenant community, then prophets, then kings, then exile, then return, then silence, then Messiah, then the gospel to the nations. This is not randomness. It is revelation. And when you see that, the question shifts. It is no longer, why Israel instead of everyone else? It becomes, why did God use Israel as a channel through which everyone else could be reached? That is a very different question. And Scripture answers in layers. Part of the answer is historical. Someone had to preserve the knowledge of the true God in a world drowning in idols. Someone had to carry the promises. Someone had to embody covenant life. Someone had to produce the scriptures that would tell the story. Someone had to preserve the genealogies that would identify the Messiah. Someone had to hold categories of sacrifice, priesthood, temple, holiness, sin, and redemption long enough for the fulfillment to arrive. Israel was not chosen as the end point. Israel was chosen as the prepared ground. And prepared ground is not glamorous. It must be broken, turned, exposed, cut open, cleared of stones. That is exactly what much of Israel's history feels like. It is the painful cultivation of a people through whom the seed of promise would come. And when that seed came, the nations were invited in. That is why the New Testament erupts with this theme. The barriers begin to fall, not because holiness stops mattering, but because Christ has fulfilled what the barriers pointed toward. The Gentiles, once far off, are brought near. The outsiders are welcomed. Those who had no covenant are invited into the blessings of the covenant through faith. Those who were strangers and aliens are called fellow heirs. This is not Plan B. This is not God recovering from a failed experiment. This is the mystery hidden for ages and then revealed, that through Israel's Messiah, the blessing promised Abraham would finally overflow to all nations. Do you see how beautiful that is? The story begins narrow so it can end wide. It begins with one family, so that every family might one day hear. It begins in one land, so that one day every land might receive the news. It begins with one altar, so that one day the final sacrifice might cover sinners from every tribe and language and people and nation. That is the scale of what God was doing. And it helps explain why Israel often misunderstood their own role. When people are entrusted with truth, they can forget why they were entrusted with it. They can turn stewardship into status. They can turn calling into comparison. They can turn privilege into pride. This happened again and again, not only in Israel, but in the human heart everywhere. Even disciples who walk with Jesus struggle with it. Who is greatest? Who belongs first? Who deserves the seat of honor? Who is inside and who is outside? That instinct lives deep in us. We want grace for ourselves and ranking for others. We want to be welcomed by God and still have someone beneath us. But Jesus destroys that ladder. He kneels with a towel. He speaks of the last becoming first. He blesses the poor in spirit. He tells stories in which the outsider has more compassion than the respected religious man. He warns those who trust in their lineage while ignoring their hearts. He says God can raise children of Abraham from stones. He says many will come from east and west and sit to feast, while some who assume their place will be shocked. He is not insulting Israel. He is exposing false confidence. Because covenant signs without covenant faithfulness had always been empty. The prophets had said this long before. Circumcise your hearts. Rend your hearts, and not just your garments. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. The issue was never external identity alone. The issue was always whether the heart responded to God in trust and obedience. That is why Paul later makes such a profound argument. Not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel in the deepest covenant sense. In other words, mere outward membership was never enough. The true people of God are not defined by flesh alone, but by promise, by faith, by the work of God. This does not erase ethnic Israel from history. It reveals what history was meant to teach, that God's ultimate people are those who trust His promise. And because the promise reaches its fulfillment in Christ, anyone united to Christ by faith becomes an heir of that promise. Now, think about what that means for the original question. Why did God choose Israel and not others? In one sense, He did choose Israel uniquely in history for a unique role. But in another sense, that choice was never rejection of all others. It was the beginning of their inclusion. The nations were always on God's horizon. You can hear it in the Psalms. Let the nations be glad. Declare His glory among the nations. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. You can hear it in Isaiah. The servant will be a light to the Gentiles. God's salvation will reach to the ends of the earth. Foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord will be welcomed. You can hear it in the promise to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. The universal heartbeat was there from the start. So Israel's existence was missionary even before the word existed. They were meant to display the character of God before the watching world. That does not mean they were sent out in the same way the church later would be sent. Their historical role was different. But their very existence, their laws, their worship, their deliverance, their judgments, and their restorations were supposed to testify to the nations that the Lord alone is God. When Israel obeyed, the nations were meant to see wisdom. When Israel worshipped, the nations were meant to glimpse holiness. When Israel was delivered, the nations were meant to fear the Lord. When Israel was judged, the nations were meant to understand that this God cannot be manipulated. Everything about them was revelatory. And that is still true in how we read their story now. Israel's history is not just ancient information. It is revelation. It is a mirror. It is a warning. It is an invitation. It shows us what God is like. It shows us what man is like. It shows us how seriously God takes idolatry. It shows us how patient He is with weakness. It shows us how dangerous spiritual arrogance can be. It shows us that religious systems cannot save rebellious hearts. It shows us that sacrifice without repentance becomes theater. It shows us that kings fail, priests fail, prophets suffer, and nations crumble. And through it all, it shows us that God does not fail. That may be the deepest answer of all. God chose Israel because through them He would show the world the difference between human failure and divine faithfulness. If He had chosen a people who never stumbled, we might think redemption belongs to the strong. If He had built His plan through an empire, we might think power proves truth. If He had centered history around a nation admired by all, we might assume blessing flows naturally to the impressive. But instead, He chose a stubborn people, placed them under a holy covenant, expose their sin, discipline their rebellion, restore them in mercy, and through them brought forth the Savior. That way, the message could never be mistaken. Salvation is of the Lord, not of heritage, not of military power, not of wisdom, not of ritual alone, not of ethnic pride, not of political dominance, of the Lord. And because it is of the Lord, it can be extended to the undeserving. That includes the nations. That includes the outsider. That includes the broken. That includes the ashamed. That includes those who once bowed to idols of stone, silver, appetite, ambition, lust, violence, or self. That includes people who were born far from Jerusalem and never walked the land of the patriarchs. That includes people whose family line holds no ancient covenant sign. That includes people who once mocked the faith, ignored God, or ran from truth. It includes sinners, which means it includes us. That is why the gospel is so stunning. The same God who revealed himself in Israel now announces mercy to the world through Israel's Messiah. And this mercy is not vague tolerance. It is costly redemption. The cross stands at the center. There, all the threads meet. The Passover lamb, the Day of Atonement, the suffering servant, the rejected stone, the pierced one, the righteous sufferer, the covenant blood, the obedient son. At the cross, Jesus bears what Israel's sacrifices only symbolized. He carries sin. He endures wrath. He fulfills righteousness. He opens access. He tears the veil. He becomes both priest and offering. And because he does this as a Jewish Messiah promised in Israel's scriptures, the nations do not receive salvation apart from Israel's story. They receive salvation through its fulfillment. That is why Christianity without the Old Testament becomes shallow so quickly. If you sever Christ from Israel's story, you lose the depth of what he came to do. Then the cross becomes a vague symbol of love rather than the climactic fulfillment of covenant history. Then grace becomes sentimental rather than holy. Then sin becomes merely emotional pain rather than rebellion against the living God. Then redemption becomes self-improvement rather than blood-bought rescue. But when you understand why Israel was chosen, Christ becomes clearer. You see why sacrifice mattered, why priesthood mattered, why temple mattered, why covenant mattered, why kingship mattered, why exile mattered, why prophecy mattered. They all prepared the imagination of the world for the coming of the Redeemer. Without Israel, the categories are dim. With Israel, they blaze. And still, there is more, because the opening of the door to everyone does not mean every person automatically walks through it. Invitation is not the same as acceptance. The gospel goes wide, but it must also go deep. Each heart must answer. Will you trust the promise or cling to yourself? Will you accept mercy or defend your own righteousness? Will you bow before the Messiah or stumble over him? This has always been the dividing line. Even within Israel, this was a dividing line. Some believed, some hardened themselves, some saw and worshipped, some saw and plotted, some heard the prophets and trembled, some heard the prophets and killed them. The same sun that melts wax hardens clay. And the same Christ who saved the humble becomes a stone of offense to the proud. So when we talk about God choosing Israel, we should not talk as if this were merely an ancient political decision. It was spiritual preparation. It was redemptive architecture. It was a slow, painful, beautiful building of a road by which mercy would travel into the whole world. That road ran through patriarch tents, Egyptian slavery, wilderness dust, Sinai thunder, tabernacle smoke, conquest, Judges monarchy, civil war, prophetic tears, Assyrian terror, Babylonian chains, Persian decrees, Greek pressure, Roman domination, and finally Bethlehem, Nazareth, Galilee, Jerusalem, Golgotha, and an empty tomb. One long road, one coherent story, one faithful God. Now imagine if God had skipped all that. Imagine if he had simply announced from heaven, "Trust me," with no history, no categories, no covenant, no sacrifice, no prophets, no story. Would we understand the depth of sin? Would we understand the cost of holiness? Would we understand why forgiveness cannot be reduced to denial? Would we understand why God's mercy is astonishing rather than automatic? Probably not. We need the story. We need the slow revelation. We need to see generations waiting. We need to feel the ache of incomplete things. We need promises hanging in the air for centuries, so that when Christ appears, we can understand that God has not forgotten. He has been preparing. That is another reason Israel was chosen, not just to carry revelation, but to teach the world to wait. Waiting is part of faith. Abraham waits for a son. Israel waits in slavery. Moses waits in the wilderness. David waits for the throne. Prophets wait for fulfillment. Exiles wait for restoration. The faithful remnant waits through silence. And then, after Christ comes, the church waits for his return. Waiting runs through the whole story because faith is not control. Faith is trust in the character of God when the promise is still unfolding. Israel learned that in history. And through their story, so do we, but not everyone accepted the widened door. This is important too. When Gentiles began turning to the God of Israel through Christ, it caused deep controversy. Of course it did. Something massive was happening. The promises long guarded within one covenant people were now flooding outward. Men and women who had never kept the ceremonial law, never carried the sign of circumcision, never lived under Israel's national identity, were receiving the Spirit by faith in the Jewish Messiah. That was not easy for everyone to accept. Some wanted to keep the door narrow. Some wanted the nations to enter, but only after becoming culturally Jewish. Some wanted grace, but with manageable boundaries. Yet the apostles recognized that God himself had acted. The Spirit had fallen on outsiders. Faith had appeared where many did not expect it. And the church had to wrestle with the truth already embedded in Abraham's promise. The blessing was always intended for the nations. So the early church did not invent universality. It discovered it more fully. It did not discard Israel. It watched Israel's Messiah complete Israel's mission. That is why the New Testament is filled with both continuity and surprise. Continuity, because the story remains one story. Surprise, because many assumptions about who would respond and how they would enter were shattered. The proud were offended. The humble rejoiced. The religiously confident stumbled. The desperate came running. Roman centurions showed faith. Syrophoenician women persevered. Samaritans received mercy. Fishermen became witnesses. Persecutors became apostles. Idol worshippers became saints. The door was open, and yet the opening of the door did not mean the end of Israel's significance in God's unfolding purposes. The New Testament speaks with grief and hope about Israel. Paul can speak of great sorrow for his kinsmen according to the flesh, because to them belong the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promises, and from them comes the Messiah. He can also speak of a remnant chosen by grace. He can warn Gentile believers not to boast, using the image of branches grafted into an olive tree. That warning matters, because once the nations are welcomed, they face the same temptation Israel faced. Pride, spiritual pride, the dangerous belief that receiving mercy makes us superior rather than grateful. Paul crushes that impulse. You do not support the root supports you. In other words, if Gentile believers stand in the blessings of God's covenant mercy, they stand there because they have been joined to what God was already doing through Israel's story and Israel's Messiah. This should produce humility, not arrogance. Gratitude, not contempt. Wonder, not boasting. That means the right answer to God choosing Israel is never mockery. It is awe, because through that choice, people far away were brought near. And if you are a believer from the nations, you are part of the far away that has been brought near. You are living proof that Abraham's promise overflowed. You are evidence that the door really opened. You are part of the harvest that began with a single call to leave home and trust God. Think about the scale of that. A man leaves you are. Centuries pass. A nation is formed. A covenant is given. A land is promised. A law is written. Sacrifices are established. Kings rise and fall. Prophets cry out. Empires come and go. The Messiah appears. He dies and rises. The Spirit is poured out. And now people thousands of miles from Abraham, speaking languages Abraham never heard, can call on the God of Abraham through Jesus the Messiah. That is not a side effect. That is a fulfillment of the plan. So then, was God unfair to the other nations in the Old Testament period? We must answer carefully. The Bible never portrays the nations as innocent seekers unfairly denied access to a God hiding from them. The nations had revelation in creation. They had conscience. They had the witness of God's acts in history. They heard of Israel's deliverance. Some individuals among them responded in faith. Rahab did. Ruth did. Naaman did. The people of Nineveh repented when Jonah preached. Foreigners could join themselves to the God of Israel. Even in the Old Testament, the door was not locked as absolutely as people often imagine. It was not yet fully open in the New Testament sense, but neither was it entirely shut. That matters because it shows the wideness of God's mercy even before Christ. He was never provincial, never ethnically insecure, never merely tribal. He ruled all nations, even while revealing himself specially through one. This is a distinction many miss. God's universal sovereignty and God's specific covenant choice are not opposites. They are the same hand working in two ways. One wide enough to hold the universe, one precise enough to write a story through a single family. And when you finally see that, the tension disappears. Because the God who rules over all nations chose one nation not to limit his reach, but to reveal it. Israel was never the finish line. It was the doorway. Through them, the world learned who God is. Through them, the world saw what happens when humanity walks with God and what happens when it walks away. Through them, the world received the law, the prophets, the warnings, and the promises. And through them came the Messiah. Everything converges there. Not in politics, not in geography, not in ethnicity, in a person. Because when Jesus came, he didn't narrow the story. He completed it. He took everything Israel carried and made it accessible to everyone. The sacrifice became final. The temple became unnecessary. The separation became broken. And suddenly, what began as a covenant with one people became an invitation to all people, not to replace Israel, but to fulfill what Israel was always meant to point toward. That's why this matters more than people think, because many still misunderstand the word chosen. They hear it and think exclusion. God meant it as a mission. Israel was chosen to carry the light, and now that light has reached you. Think about that for a moment. You were not there in the wilderness. You didn't stand at Sinai. You didn't walk through the Red Sea. And yet, the same story found you. The same promise reached you. The same God calls you. That is not coincidence. That is continuation. Because the story didn't end with Israel. It expanded through them until it reached every corner of the world, until it reached people who once felt like outsiders, people like us. And now the question is no longer historical. It's personal. If God used one nation to reach the world, what will he do through one life that says yes? Because the truth is, being chosen was never about being better. It was always about being willing. And maybe that's the part most people miss. God is still choosing. Not nations the way he once did, but hearts, calling, inviting, opening doors. The same way he did with Abraham. The same way he did with Israel. The same way he did through Christ. So the real question is not, why Israel and not others? The real question is, now that the door is open, will you walk through it? If this made you see the story differently, write, door is open in the comments. And tell me, do you believe God still calls ordinary people today? Or do you think that story ended long ago?